What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today we're going to be talking about the best underwater guns to use in Modern Warfare 2, and the main reason I'm making this video now is we have Vondel Waterfront, which features a lot of underwater areas, and therefore potentially a lot of underwater combat, so you want to make sure you've got the right secondary in your pocket if you plan on playing in those underwater areas. And I mentioned secondary because, as I'm sure many of you guys know, when you're underwater, you are only able to use sidearms. You aren't able to use any of the primary weapons while underwater, although you can use them if you swim on top of the water. So today, we're just focusing on the sidearms, and the primary thing we're going to be talking about here is what happens to our damages and our range values. My initial assumption before going into the testing here is that pistols would just have reduced damage when underwater. And it turns out that's not entirely the case. Instead, it's primarily just the ranges that are affected, with a couple exceptions I want to point out. When it comes to the Basilisk, when we're not underwater, we have the ability to get a one-shot kill to the upper torso within close ranges. However, the moment you go underwater, even if you're literally point blank to your target, you can no longer get a one-shot kill to the upper torso. So that first damage range when you go underwater is just deleted from that gun. On a similar note, with the X13, it also loses its maximum damage range when you go underwater. Because above water, you deal 25 damage to the torso up close, but below water, you're dealing 21 damage to the torso up close. And those are the only two actual damage value reductions that we see when going underwater. In saying that though, the ranges are massively compressed, and the biggest thing to point out here is with all of these pistols, assuming you're not using a barrel that increases their ranges at least, your bullet will only travel 11 meters. Anything beyond 11 meters, you literally can't even get a hit on the enemy player. So it's good to know that there's no point in even trying to shoot at enemies that are beyond that 11 meter range when underwater, because your bullet will never reach them. Unless you use attachments that extend your range, like a barrel or some of the suppressors for instance, those can give you a very slight improvement to your range, but at most we're looking at like 2 to 3 meters, so those won't make a huge difference there. Now, before we get into the actual range chart and comparison, I do want to explain a couple very interesting results I found here, and these results are with the FTAC Siege as well as the GS Magna. Unlike the Basilisk and X13 that had their damage values reduced, for some reason, these two handguns have a totally different damage profile underwater, and it turns out in both of these cases, they're actually massively buffed when fired underwater. So this is almost definitely a bug because that doesn't make any sense at all. As long as you're within the range where you can hit enemy players, so 11 meters, these two guns are significantly better when used underwater compared to above water. So with the FTAC Siege, for instance, above water, it's going to be a 6 to 8 shot kill to the torso, whereas below water, it's now a 4 to 5 shot kill with the same rate of fire. Then with the GS Magna, this is always going to be a 3 shot kill to the upper torso, whereas underwater, it's going to be a 2 to 3 shot kill to the upper torso. We actually deal 80 damage to the upper torso up close with that, whereas above water, we only deal 49 damage to the upper torso. So those are a couple anomalies here, and therefore it's already likely you know which guns I'm going to be suggesting for underwater use. But now let's finally have a look at our underwater range comparison. Keeping in mind with this, all the time to kill values are using the fastest possible trigger, just to really show off the true potential of these guns in a more realistic scenario, because more often than not, you're going to be using the triggers that give you the fastest fire rate possible. And as we can see here, like I said, none of these pistols even deal damage beyond 11 meters. And it's also worth noting, our maximum damage ranges with almost all these pistols are right around 2.5 meters. They're not very good. And therefore, in most gunfights that you'll actually find yourself in underwater, we want to be looking more at like mid to longer ranges within the confines of this chart. And therefore, when you look at something like the P890, it might be really promising up close within 5 meters with a 170 millisecond time to kill potential, but that increases very harshly as soon as you get to about 6.5 to 7 meters. It's now going to kill the slowest out of all of these underwater, and therefore I wouldn't consider that to be an ideal choice. Now obviously, if you take a good look at this chart, and you also consider that damage anomaly that I presented to you guys, both the FTAC Siege and the GS Magna are incredible options when used underwater, compared to their counterparts. Now, when we really hone in on those two, which one is better? Well, technically the GS Magna can kill a little bit faster up close. I mean, they're both incredibly fast. 150 milliseconds with the FTAC Siege is already very, very fast. But the GS Magna has a slight advantage there. The main thing I wanted to point out is the FTAC Siege's slowest time to kill potential underwater, assuming you're within the hit potential range. This is just 200 milliseconds, which is ridiculously fast. And when you also consider the fact that the F-Tac Siege has very little recoil, a massive magazine capacity potential, and just a really high fire rate, so if you miss a few shots, it's really not going to hurt your time to kill that much. When you combine all of that, this means the F-Tac Siege is absolutely the clear winner here as far as the best underwater gun in the game. And I would just say the GS Magna is a pretty good alternative to that if you really don't want to use the F-Tac Siege. But another thing I wanted to point out with this is even if we didn't have that damage anomaly, I would still consider the F-Tac Siege to be the best underwater gun, largely due to the fact that it has that high fire rate, it has that bigger magazine capacity, so it can afford to miss a few shots underwater, and it still would have a solid time to kill potential, even if we had the above water damage. So there we go. That's probably the answer you guys were looking for. I'm sure many of you guys already suspected that would be the case. The F-Tac Siege is a very versatile sidearm. You may be wondering whether or not to use this akimbo though. Personally, I would recommend just sticking to using a single version of this gun rather than akimbo. And just a couple other notes about underwater play. What happens when an enemy is above water shooting down on you as you're underwater? Will you take reduced damage from their bullets? It turns out, yes, they will actually see a little bit of a damage reduction when shooting down, and it does depend on how deep in the water you are as well. If you're near the surface of the water, they won't really be seeing any reduced damage, but as you dive deeper, you will take less and less damage, as you should. Now, on the flip side of that, what if you're underwater, but you're shooting at somebody that's above water? It turns out with this one, as far as I can tell, you get pretty much standard damage values that you would normally expect if you were above water. Although I believe you'll still see a bit of a range reduction there. And this includes that damage anomaly with the F-Tac Siege and GS Magna. You no longer get that damage boost even if you are underwater. If your enemy isn't also underwater, no damage boost for you. You just get the standard damage profile that you would have if you weren't underwater. And this also applies to that range cap. If you're underwater shooting at somebody that's not underwater, you can now hit them from farther than 11 meters away. Although at that point, it's pretty much impossible to spot targets that are above water. Now, one final thing I wanted to point out here that I happened to notice while I was playing and testing out the new MX Guardian shotgun. While regular buckshot can penetrate the water and you can kill an enemy that's underwater with your shotgun when you're above the water, Dragon's Breath rounds can't deal any damage at all to anybody that's underwater. Even if they're just below the surface, you can't even hit them when using Dragon's Breath, and that was just something interesting I thought I'd point out. And with that, that is going to wrap it up for today's video, and this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. When it comes to underwater play in Modern Warfare 2 and how they've balanced underwater play, do you guys like this or not so much? Do you like the fact that you can only use pistols when underwater? You can't just go underwater with your primary weapon like in Black Ops 3? And then also, what do you guys think about the fact that they've limited the ranges significantly when underwater, so you can only hit other underwater players out to about 11 meters or so? Do you think these are good things that keep the water balanced nicely, or not so much? Just let me know all of those thoughts down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated, and don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.